The frost came early that year, not the soft kind that burns off by mid-morning, but the kind that settles into the grass and stays, turning the prairie silver before the sun even considers rising. I stood outside the teepee I'd raised 2 weeks earlier, my breath visible in the pre-dawn light, and felt the season change its mind about mercy. October had been warm until it wasn't. That's how it works out here. Summer stays as long as it can, then leaves all at once, and if you're not ready, the land doesn't much care. The teepee stood 15 feet tall, maybe a bit more when you counted the poles where they crossed at the top. 18 lodge poles cut from straight pine, hauled down from the hills where the trees grow tall and the wind keeps them honest. I'd sewn the cover myself over the course of late summer, not buffalo hide like the old ones used, but heavy canvas treated with a mix of beeswax and paraffin to shed water and hold back wind. It smelled like hope and inexperience, that cover. Like something I believed would work without yet knowing if it would. I'd pitched it on a flat stretch of prairie about 300 yards from the gravel road, far enough that headlights at night didn't bother me, close enough that neighbors driving past could see smoke rising from the smoke hole and know someone was there. Traditional placement, I'd been told, accounted for wind and water, sun and slope. But I was learning as I went, and flat ground seemed easier than trying to figure out drainage and prevailing winds when winter was already sharpening its teeth on the horizon. The door faced east, the way it's supposed to, the way the sun rises, the way the old lodges always faced so that morning light came in first, before the heat of the day, before the work began. I liked that about it, the idea that structure and tradition carried meaning, that there were reasons for things, even if I didn't fully understand them yet. My grandfather had lived in lodges like this when he was young, before the government schools, before the allotments, before everything changed in ways that don't heal in a single lifetime. He never talked much about those years, but he'd nod when he saw pictures of teepees in books, and once he told me that a good lodge could keep you alive when nothing else would. I wanted to know if that was true. The neighbors thought I was crazy, which is fair. Bill Torstenson, who ran cattle on the land to the north, stopped his truck one afternoon while I was lashing the poles together and asked if I was planning to live in that thing or just play Indian for a few weekends. I told him I'd be there through winter, and he looked at the sky like it might offer him an explanation for my poor judgment. "Gets to 30 below out here," he said. "Sometimes colder. Wind comes down off those hills like it's got a personal grudge." I knew that. I'd grown up 20 miles from here, spent enough winters watching snow pile against fences and ice form on the inside of poorly insulated windows. But knowing about cold and living through it in a canvas lodge are different things, and I hadn't yet learned the difference. The first night I slept there, I didn't build a fire. It was still warm enough, mid-50s maybe, and I wanted to see what the lodge felt like without flame and smoke, complicating things. I lay on a bedroll spread over bare ground, looking up at the smoke hole where stars appeared and disappeared as clouds moved across them, and listened to the wind test the canvas. It wasn't a gentle sound. The cover snapped and pulled against the ropes, and the poles creaked in their lashings, and I realized for the first time that a teepee isn't a static thing. It moves. It breathes. The whole structure shifts and adjusts with the wind, giving just enough to survive, but not so much that it collapses. I liked that, too. The honesty of it. By the second week of October, I'd settled into a rhythm. I woke with the light boiled water for coffee on a small fire outside, and spent the days working on the things a person has to work on when they've decided to live in a way that requires constant attention. I gathered firewood from deadfall along the creek bottom, stacked it under a tarp near the lodge, and learned to split pine and cottonwood and the occasional juniper that burned hot and fast and smelled like something sacred. I hauled water in 5-gallon jugs from a hand pump a quarter mile away, built a small rack for drying clothes, and tried to figure out where to store food so that mice wouldn't find it and cold wouldn't ruin it. People stopped by more often than I expected. Some were curious, some were concerned, and a few were just killing time on their way to somewhere else. A woman named Iris, who lived in a small house about a mile west, brought me a loaf of bread and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, which wasn't exactly true, but felt true enough. An older man named Eugene, who'd worked on the reservation for years and knew more about traditional ways than most, walked around the teepee once, tugged on a couple of the ropes, and said, "You'll want to dig down before the real cold comes." I didn't know what he meant. "Dig down?" I asked. "The floor," he said. "You got it sitting right on the grass. Cold's going to come up from the ground, steal the heat faster than you can make it. Old lodges sat low, not a lot, just enough." I nodded, but I didn't really understand. The ground seemed solid, stable, neutral. I didn't yet know that Earth has its own temperature, its own moods, its own way of interacting with fire and air and the bodies of people trying to stay warm. By the third week, the nights were dropping into the 30s. I built my first fire inside the lodge, a small thing, just enough to take the edge off the cold that was starting to settle in after sunset. I used a fire ring I'd made from stones I'd gathered along the creek, placed it dead center of the lodge, and fed it with kindling and small pieces of split pine. The fire caught easily, the way pine does, and for a while the lodge filled with warmth and the smell of burning resin and the soft crackle of wood giving itself to flame. I sat cross-legged near the fire, close enough to feel the heat on my face, and watched the smoke rise toward the hole at the top. The smoke flaps were open, two triangular pieces of canvas that extended from the top of the lodge, controlled by poles you could adjust from the outside to direct the smoke out and keep the rain from coming in. I'd set them the way I thought made sense, and the smoke rose clean and steady, disappearing into the night. It felt good. It felt like I'd figured something out. But when I lay down to sleep a few hours later, after the fire had burned down to coals, the cold came back, not all at once, but steadily, creeping in from the edges of the lodge, rising up from the ground beneath my bedroll, finding the gaps between blankets and the places where my body met the earth. By midnight, I was awake, shivering despite 2 wool blankets and a sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees. The coals still glowed faintly in the fire ring, but the heat they gave off seemed to vanish before it reached me. I got up, fed the fire, sat close until I felt warm again, then lay back down. An hour later, I was cold again. I did this 3 times before morning, burning through more wood than I'd planned, and when the sun finally rose and I crawled out of the lodge into the frost-bright morning, I felt defeated in a way I hadn't expected. The lodge was supposed to work. The fire was supposed to keep me warm. That's how it worked in every story, every image, every idea I had about what this would be like. But something was wrong. The heat wasn't staying. The fire wasn't enough. And I didn't yet know why. Bill Torstenson drove past that morning, slowed down, rolled his window down and called out, "Cold enough for you?" I waved. He kept driving. I stood there in the frost, looking at the teepee with its smoke hole still breathing out the last remnants of heat from a fire that hadn't kept me warm, and realized I'd built something I didn't yet understand. The structure was right, the poles, the cover, the door facing east. But structure isn't the same as knowledge, and knowledge isn't the same as survival. I needed to learn what I was doing wrong. I needed to learn what the cold was trying to teach me. The fire burned well enough. That was the frustrating part. I could build a fire, had been building fires since I was old enough to hold a match, and the flames rose clean and hot, the wood caught without complaint, and the smoke drew upward through the hole at the top of the lodge the way smoke is supposed to. But heat, I was learning, doesn't follow the rules you expect. It doesn't stay where you want it. It rises, yes, but it also escapes, radiates, dissipates into the air faster than you can replace it, unless you understand something I didn't yet understand. I woke on the fourth night of serious cold with frost on the inside of my sleeping bag. Not heavy frost, just a thin layer of ice crystals where my breath had condensed against the fabric. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind press against the canvas, and felt the cold working its way through the layers of wool and down and synthetic insulation I'd wrapped myself in. The fire had gone out sometime in the night. I could smell the dead smoke, the particular scent of pine coals gone gray and powerless. My body ached from shivering, that deep ache that comes from muscles working all night to generate heat they can't hold on to. I told myself I'd get up and rebuild the fire. I told myself that for maybe 10 minutes, lying there, trying to will warmth back into my hands and feet. Finally, I forced myself out of the sleeping bag and crouched near the fire ring, my breath visible in the beam of the small headlamp I wore. The coals were dead, completely cold. I touched one with my finger and felt nothing but stone. That seemed wrong. I'd banked the fire before I went to sleep, buried it under ash the way I'd been taught, and I'd expected at least some ember to survive until morning. But there was nothing. The cold had taken it all. I rebuilt the fire from scratch, shaving curls of fat wood with my knife, stacking kindling in a loose cone, nursing the flame until it caught and spread. The heat came back quickly once the fire was going, and I sat close, closer than was probably safe, letting the warmth soak into my chest and face. But even as I sat there, I could feel the cold at my back, at my sides, rising up from the ground beneath me. The lodge was maybe 30 degrees warmer near the fire than it was at the walls, and the difference was sharp enough that moving even a few feet away felt like stepping into a different season. I burned wood all morning just to stay warm enough to think clearly. By noon, I'd gone through a quarter of the stack I'd planned to last a week. That math didn't work. At this rate, I'd run out of firewood by mid-November, and winter didn't even start until December. Something was fundamentally wrong with how I was approaching this, but I didn't know what. I spent the afternoon walking the property, gathering more deadfall, thinking about heat and how it moves. Fire produces heat, obviously. But where does that heat go? I watched the smoke rise from the lodge, thin and pale in the daylight, and realized that smoke is just visible heat. The hottest part of the fire, the part I wanted, was escaping through the smoke hole and disappearing into the sky. What was left, the radiant heat that spread outward from the flames, had nowhere to land. It hit the canvas walls and either soaked through or reflected back, weakly. It rose to the top of the lodge and funneled out. It sank into the ground beneath the fire and vanished into the earth like water into sand. I was fighting a losing battle, trying to heat space that couldn't hold heat, trying to warm air that was being replaced constantly by cold air seeping in through the door, through the gap at the base of the cover, through a dozen places I couldn't see but could feel every time the wind changed direction. That night, I tried something different. I built the fire smaller, fed it less wood, and focused on keeping it burning steadily rather than hot. The idea was that a smaller fire would produce less heat, but maybe, that heat would stay closer to the ground, closer to where I was sitting and sleeping. It didn't work. The lodge was colder overall, and I ended up feeding the fire more anyway, trying to compensate, and by midnight I was back to burning through wood at the same unsustainable rate. I lay awake, staring at the smoke hole, watching sparks rise and vanish into the night, and felt something close to panic. Not the kind of panic that makes you run, but the kind that makes you realize you've made a miscalculation that might have consequences you're not prepared for. Winter was coming, real winter, the kind Bill Torstenson had warned me about, the kind that doesn't forgive mistakes. And I was already struggling in weather that was barely cold by prairie standards. The next morning, Iris stopped by with another loaf of bread and a thermos of soup. She stood outside the lodge, her breath fogging in the cold air, and looked at the smoke rising from the hole. "You're burning a lot of wood," she said. "Yeah," I admitted. "Staying warm?" I hesitated. Not really. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. You should talk to Eugene, she said. He knows about these things. I asked her where I could find him, and she told me he lived in a small cabin about 3 miles north, near the old mission church. She said he'd lived in traditional lodges when he was younger, back when there were still people around who remembered how to build them properly, how to live in them through winters that made this one look mild. I thanked her for the soup and the advice, and after she left I stood outside the lodge and looked at it the way she had, objectively, like it was someone else's problem. The smoke rose straight and clean. The canvas was tight against the poles, no gaps that I could see. The door faced east. Everything looked right. But right in appearance isn't the same as right in function, and I was starting to understand that the difference between the two was going to determine whether I made it through the season or whether I'd end up knocking on Iris's door in January, asking if she had a spare room. I decided to visit Eugene. I found him that afternoon, splitting wood outside a small log cabin that looked like it had been there since before roads came through this part of the country. He was maybe 70, wiry and strong in the way people get when they've worked their whole lives, and he didn't stop splitting when I walked up, just nodded, brought them all down on a round of pine, watched it split clean, then looked at me. "You're the one with the lodge," he said. "Yeah." "Cold?" "Yeah." He set them all down and walked over to a bench near the cabin, gestured for me to sit. We sat there in the thin November sunshine, not talking for a minute, and then he asked me how I'd set up the lodge. I told him, poles, canvas, fire ring in the center, door facing east. "Where's the fire ring sitting?" he asked. "On the ground," I said. "Just the grass." He shook his head slowly. "That's your problem." "The ground?" "The ground," he confirmed. "Fire sitting right on top of it, heat sinking straight down into earth that's already cold. You're heating the ground, not the lodge. And the ground," he paused, looked at me to make sure I was listening. "The ground's got more mass than you'll ever heat with a small fire. It just takes and never gives back." I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd thought the ground was neutral, just a surface to build on. "The old lodges sat low," Eugene continued. "Dug down, not deep, just a foot, maybe 18 inches, enough that the floor was below the frost line, below where the wind could steal the heat. You dig down, you make the earth part of the structure. It becomes a wall. It holds the heat instead of pulling it away." I asked him if that was the only problem. He smiled, not unkindly. "No," he said, "but it's the first one." Eugene's lodge sat on the east side of his property, maybe 100 yards from the cabin, tucked into the slope of a low hill that rose gradually toward a line of cottonwoods, marking an old creek bed. I'd driven past it a dozen times over the years and never really looked at it, just another teepee in a landscape where traditional structures were still common enough not to draw attention. But now, standing beside Eugene as he walked me toward it, I saw it differently. I saw it as a problem I was trying to solve. The first thing I noticed was that it sat low. Not dramatically, you wouldn't see it from a distance and think someone had dug a pit, but low enough that the base of the lodge was set into the earth rather than resting on top of it. The effect was subtle but immediate. The structure looked settled, permanent, like it had grown there rather than been erected. "Dug down about 14 inches, Eugene said, stopping a few feet from the entrance. "Took me 2 days with a shovel. Ground's hard here, clay and rock once you get past the topsoil, but it's worth it." The door faced southeast, angled to catch the morning sun, but avoid the worst of the north wind. The cover was buffalo hide, dark and smooth with age, patched in a few places, but intact. Smoke rose from the hole at the top, thin and lazy, like it wasn't in any hurry to leave. "You keep a fire going all the time?" I asked. "Most of the time," Eugene said, "but I don't need much. Come on." He pulled back the door flap, and I followed him inside. The warmth hit me immediately, not the aggressive heat of a fire stoked too high, but a steady, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire itself was small, barely more than a handful of coals glowing in a shallow depression at the center of the lodge. But the space felt warm in a way mine never had, even when I was burning 3 times as much wood. I stood just inside the entrance and tried to understand what I was seeing. The floor was earth, packed smooth and hard, sloping gently down from the edges toward the center. Around the fire, stones, river stones, smooth and fist-sized, were arranged in a loose ring, some half buried in the dirt. The walls of the lodge curved inward slightly as they rose, and where the canvas met the ground, there was no gap. The earth itself formed a seal, packed tight against the base of the cover. Eugene sat down on a low bench made from a split log, motioned for me to sit on a pile of folded blankets near the fire. I sat and immediately felt the warmth coming up from the ground beneath me. Not cold, the way my lodge floor was cold, but warm. Almost body temperature. "How?" I asked. Eugene smiled. "The earth," he said. "Once you get below the frost line, the ground holds a steady temperature, warmer than the air in winter, cooler than the air in summer. You dig down, you tap into that. The floor becomes part of the heating system." I looked at the fire, then at the stones around it. "And the stones?" "Thermal mass," he said. "They heat up slow, but they hold it. I put them in the fire during the day when it's burning hotter, then move them to the edges at night. They radiate heat for hours. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and they're still warm enough to feel from a few feet away." I reached out and touched one of the stones near the fire. It was hot, too hot to hold. But the ones farther out were just warm, and the heat coming off them was steady, reliable. Not the spiking, fading heat of burning wood, but something more patient. "The ground pulls heat down," Eugene continued, "but if you dig down first, if you put the fire below the level where cold air wants to settle, then the heat has nowhere to go but out. It spreads, it fills the space, and the earth around it, it starts to warm up. Takes a few days, maybe a week, but once it's warm, it stays warm. The ground stops being your enemy and starts being your ally." I thought about my lodge sitting on top of cold ground, the fire losing heat into the earth faster than I could replace it. I thought about waking up shivering, about burning through wood, about the panic I'd felt, realizing I didn't understand what I was doing. "I didn't know," I said. "Most people don't," Eugene said. "It's not something you can learn from a book. You have to feel it, live it. The old ones, they didn't have a choice. They learned because they had to, because freezing wasn't an option. Now we've got furnaces and insulation and electricity, and we forget that heat is a thing you have to understand, not just produce." He stood, moved to the edge of the lodge where a pile of split juniper sat stacked against the wall. He took a single piece, placed it on the coals, and sat back down. The wood caught slowly, the flame small and controlled. "You don't need a big fire," he said. "You need a smart fire, one that works with the structure, not against it." I watched the flames curl. Around the juniper, watched the smoke rise and disappear through the hole at the top, and for the first time since I'd started this, I felt like I was seeing instead of just looking. The lodge wasn't just a shelter. It was a system. Every part of it, the floor, the fire, the stones, the way the cover sat against the ground, worked together. Remove one part, misunderstand one element, and the whole thing failed. "What about the smoke hole?" I asked. "The flaps. Do you adjust them?" "All the time," Eugene said. "Wind changes, you change the flaps. Fire burns hotter, you open them more. Fire dies down, you close them to hold the heat. It's not complicated, but you have to pay attention. The lodge tells you what it needs if you listen." I thought about my lodge, the smoke flaps set and forgotten, the heat escaping while I slept. I hadn't been listening. I'd been assuming. We sat there for maybe an hour, not talking much, just sitting in the warmth. Eugene fed the fire twice more, each time with a single piece of wood no bigger than my forearm. The heat never spiked, never faded. It just stayed, steady and reliable, and I began to understand that this was what survival looked like. Not fighting the cold, not burning through resources in a panic, but working with the physics of heat and earth and air until they balanced. When I finally stood to leave, Eugene walked me to the door. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the temperature already dropping as the sun moved toward the horizon. "You'll figure it out," he said. "But you have to be willing to start over, dig down, reset the fire, learn what the ground's trying to tell you." I thanked him, walked back to my truck, and drove the 3 miles to my own lodge. It sat there on the flat prairie, smoke rising from the hole, and I saw it now for what it was, a structure I'd built with my hands, but didn't yet understand with my body. I grabbed a shovel from the truck bed and started digging. The earth resisted. That was the first lesson. I'd expected dirt, loose, yielding, the kind you could move with a shovel and a little effort. But 6 inches down, I hit clay. Heavy gray clay that clung to the blade and came up in thick clumps that didn't crumble but held their shape like something sculpted. Below that, gravel. Small stones mixed with compacted soil, the kind of substrate that forms over centuries of freezing and thawing, of water seeping down and minerals crystallizing, and the weight of winter pressing everything together into something harder than intent. I dug for 3 days. The first day, I moved the fire ring and everything I'd stored inside the lodge, then marked out a circle about 12 feet in diameter, centered where the fire had been. I started at the east side, near the door, and worked my way around, sinking the shovel blade, levering up clay and gravel, piling it outside the lodge. My hands blistered within the first hour. By evening, I'd dug down maybe 6 inches across half the circle, and my back felt like something broken that was still trying to function. I slept outside that night. Didn't seem right to sleep in a lodge I was tearing apart, and woke before dawn with frost on my sleeping bag, and the certainty that this was either the smartest thing I'd done or the stupidest. The second day, I reached 12 inches. The ground fought me every foot of the way, but I learned its rhythms. The clay came up easier if I let the shovel sit for a moment after driving it in, let the blade settle into the seam before levering back. The gravel loosened if I broke it up first with a pick, then scooped it out with the shovel. Slow work, but honest. The kind of work that doesn't lie to you about how much effort survival actually takes. Eugene stopped by in the afternoon, looked at the hole I was making, and nodded. 14 inches is better, he said. Get below the frost line. So I kept digging. By the end of the third day, I had a floor sunk 14 inches into the prairie, the walls of the pit sloping gently up to meet the original ground level. I'd hauled out maybe 2 tons of earth, piled it in a berm around the north and west sides of the lodge where it would serve as a windbreak. The floor itself I smoothed and compacted, pounding it flat with the back of the shovel until it was hard as pavement. I stood at the center of the pit, looking up at the lodge poles rising above me, and felt the difference immediately. The wind that had been constant, that had found every gap and pressed cold air through the canvas, was muted now. Not gone, wind doesn't disappear, but lessened. The earth walls absorbed it, deflected it, sent it over the top of the lodge instead of through it. I reset the fire ring that evening, placing it in a shallow depression at the center of the floor, then gathered stones from the creek bed the way Eugene had shown me. River stones, smooth and dense, the kind that hold heat without cracking. I arranged them in a circle around the fire pit, buried some of them halfway into the ground, left others sitting on the surface. Then I built a fire. The flames rose clean, fed by dry juniper and cottonwood, and within an hour the stones began to warm. I touched one and felt the heat sinking into it, slow and patient. I sat on the floor, my back against one of the earth walls, and waited. The heat didn't rise and vanish the way it had before. It spread. I felt it radiating from the stones, felt it reflecting off the canvas walls, felt it gathering in the space around me instead of escaping. The fire burned smaller than the fires I'd been building, maybe half the size, but the lodge was warmer. By nightfall, I could sit 5 feet from the fire and still feel comfortable. The earth beneath me wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't warm yet, that would take time, but it wasn't stealing heat from my body the way it had been. The ground had changed from an enemy to something neutral, and neutral was a victory I hadn't known I needed. I slept that night on the floor of the lodge, no fire burning, just the warmth held by the stones and the earth walls, and the canvas that now sat tight against the ground with no gap for cold air to seep through. I woke twice, but not from cold. Once because a coyote was yipping somewhere close, and once because I'd rolled onto a stone I'd left too close to my bedroll. But I wasn't shivering, wasn't desperate to rebuild the fire, wasn't burning through wood just to survive until morning. When the sun came up and the light filtered through the smoke hole, I lay there on the earthen floor and thought about what Eugene had said. The ground holds a steady temperature. Below the frost line, the earth doesn't freeze. It stays at maybe 40, 50 degrees, cold by human standards, but warmer than winter air, warmer than the surface of the prairie in January. I'd been fighting the ground, trying to heat it from above with a fire. That couldn't possibly warm that much mass. But by digging down, I'd put myself into the earth instead of on top of it. I was inside the temperature the ground held naturally, and now the fire didn't have to heat the earth, it just had to heat the air, and the earth walls kept that air from escaping. It was elegant in a way I hadn't expected, not complicated, not a trick. Just an understanding of how heat moves, how cold settles, how the earth itself can be a tool if you know how to use it. I spent the next week refining the system. I learned that the stones heated faster if I placed them directly in the fire during the day, then moved them to the perimeter at night. I learned that the earth walls warmed slowly over the course of several days, holding more heat each day until they became part of the thermal mass, radiating warmth even when the fire was out. I learned that the smoke hole needed to be adjusted constantly, smaller when the fire was low to trap heat, larger when the fire was burning hotter to create a draft that fed the flames. The wood I'd been burning through in a panic now lasted. One fire in the morning, one in the evening, each burning for an hour or two, and the lodge stayed warm enough through the night that I didn't wake shivering. I wasn't comfortable yet, not the way Eugene was comfortable in his lodge, but I wasn't suffering. I was surviving, and survival felt like progress. Bill Torstensen drove past one afternoon, saw the berm of earth I'd piled around the lodge, and stopped his truck. He walked over, hands in his pockets, looked at the whole setup, then looked at me. "Dug it down?" he asked. "Yeah," he nodded. "Smart. My granddad used to do that with the old sod houses. Said you can't beat the earth, you have to work with it." It was the first thing he'd said that felt like approval, and I took it. By mid-November, the lodge had become something I understood. Not completely. I was still learning, still adjusting, still making small mistakes, but enough. Enough to know that I wasn't going to freeze. Enough to know that the cold was still coming, but I had a way to meet it now. The ground beneath me had stopped being a problem and started being a foundation. The first real cold came the third week of November. Not the testing cold, the kind that warns you what's coming, but the committed cold, the kind that settles in and means it. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees overnight and stayed there through the next day, and the wind came down from the northwest, carrying ice crystals that stung when they hit your face. I woke that morning and saw frost an inch thick on the inside of the canvas near the smoke hole, saw my breath hanging in the air inside the lodge, and knew that digging down had been necessary but wasn't sufficient. I built the fire up, fed it more wood than I'd been using, and sat close while the flames pushed back against the cold. The heat helped, but it was localized, temporary. Move 3 feet from the fire, and you were cold again. The earth walls were warmer than they'd been before I dug down, but they weren't warm enough to radiate heat on their own. The stones I'd placed around the fire ring absorbed heat during the day, but I hadn't been moving them, hadn't been thinking of them as anything more than decorative, and by morning they were cold again, just more mass for the fire to try to heat. I thought about Eugene's lodge, about the stones he'd moved to the edges at night, about the way the heat in his space felt even, and distributed instead of spiked and fading. I thought about thermal mass, a term I'd heard but didn't really understand until I was sitting in a lodge that was barely staying warm despite my best efforts. Heat doesn't just exist. It has to go somewhere. Fire produces it, but fire is temporary. Wood burns and becomes ash, and the heat rises and escapes unless you give it something to land in, something to hold it. Stone holds heat. That's what Eugene had said, not forever, but long enough. I spent that afternoon gathering more stones from the creek bed. The water was low, barely more than a trickle between ice-crusted banks, and the stones sat exposed, smoothed by years of current and freeze-thaw cycles. I looked for dense ones, heavy for their size, the kind that felt solid when you picked them up. River stones, not shale or sandstone, that would crack when heated. I carried them back in a canvas sack, maybe 50 pounds at a time, and by evening I had a pile of them stacked outside the lodge. The next morning I rebuilt the fire and placed a dozen stones directly in the flames. Not in the coals, that would take too long, but right in the fire where the heat was most intense. I let them sit there for an hour, feeding the fire to keep it hot, and watched the stones change color. They didn't glow, but they darkened, and when I finally pulled one out with a stick, the heat coming off it was immediate and fierce. I moved the stones to the edges of the lodge, spacing them evenly around the perimeter, setting them on the earth floor where they'd radiate heat outward and downward. Then I sat back and waited. The change was subtle at first. The fire was still burning, still producing most of the immediate heat, but after 20 minutes I noticed that the cold spots near the walls weren't as cold. After an hour, I could sit anywhere in the lodge and feel warm. Not fire warm, but comfortable. The kind of warmth that doesn't spike and fade but just is. I let the fire die down to coals, then to nothing, and sat in the lodge as the afternoon light faded. The stones kept radiating. I could feel it when I held my hand near them, not burning hot, but steady, patient. The heat spread through the space, reflected off the canvas walls, sank into the earth floor, and created a microclimate that had nothing to do with active flame and everything to do with stored energy. By evening, the stones were still warm enough to feel from a few feet away. I rebuilt the fire, smaller this time, just enough to heat another batch of stones, and moved the cooler ones back into the flames. It became a rhythm, heat stones during the day when I was awake, and could tend the fire, move them to the perimeter in the evening, let them radiate through the night while I slept. The difference was immediate and undeniable. I stopped waking up cold, stopped burning through wood in a panic. The fire became a tool I used to charge the stones, and the stones became the primary source of heat, reliable and consistent in a way fire by itself could never be. I started experimenting. I learned that stones placed near where I slept kept that area warm enough that I didn't need as many blankets. I learned that burying a stone a few inches into the earth floor extended how long it radiated, something about the earth insulating it, slowing the heat loss. I learned that different stones held heat differently. Dense basalt held it longer than granite. Smooth river stones held it better than rough ones, maybe because they had more surface contact with the ground. Eugene stopped by one afternoon, saw the stones arranged around the lodge, and smiled. "You figured it out," he said. "Took me long enough." "Takes everyone long enough," he said. "You can read about it, hear about it, but until you spend a night shivering and realize the fire alone isn't enough, you don't really learn it." He showed me a few refinements, wrapping a stone in a piece of canvas before placing it near my bedroll, so the heat lasted even longer. Rotating the stones in a specific pattern, so that the ones cooling were always being replaced by freshly heated ones, using smaller stones for quick heat and larger stones for sustained warmth. The old ones, Eugene said, they understood that winter is long. You can't fight it with fire every night. You'll run out of wood, run out of energy, run out of patience. But if you store heat during the day, let the stone remember the sun and the fire, then you can make it through the night without burning yourself out. I asked him how long stones could hold heat. Depends on the stone, he said. Depends on how hot you get it, how you insulate it, how much mass it has. I've had stones stay warm enough to feel for 12 hours, longer if they're buried. 12 hours. That meant I could heat stones in the evening, bank the fire, and sleep through the night without waking to rebuild it. That meant I could finally rest the way a person needs to rest when they're living through winter in a canvas lodge on open prairie. That night, I heated a dozen large stones, placed them strategically around the lodge, 4 near my bedroll, 4 along the north wall where the wind hit hardest, 4 near the fire ring, and let the fire die to ash. I lay down, wrapped in blankets, and felt the warmth surrounding me, not from flames, but from stone, from heat that had been stored, held, and released slowly through the hours of darkness. I didn't wake until morning. The stones were cool by then, but the lodge was still warmer than the air outside. The earth walls had absorbed some of the heat during the night and were radiating it back, now slowly, the way earth does. The canvas cover, tight against the ground, had kept the warm air from escaping. The whole system, dug floor, earth walls, heated stones, controlled fire, worked together in a way that felt less like survival and more like partnership. I stood in the center of the lodge, watching the first light come through the smoke hole, and thought about memory. Not human memory, but the memory of stone. The way it holds the sun long after the sun has set. The way it remembers fire even after the flames are gone. The way it gives that memory back, patient and slow, asking nothing but that you understand what it's capable of. Winter was still coming. Colder days, longer nights, storms that would test everything I'd built. But I had stone now. I had earth. I had a system that didn't depend on burning wood faster than I could gather it. I had, for the first time since October, the feeling that I might actually make it through. The wind out here doesn't move in straight lines. It curves, eddies, finds channels and corridors, accelerates through gaps and slows in pockets. You can't see it, but you can feel it, especially in a structure that's designed to move with it rather than resist it. The tipi, I was learning, wasn't just a shelter. It was a relationship with wind, and understanding that relationship was the difference between fighting the cold and working with it. The first blizzard came in early December. I woke to the sound of canvas snapping and the entire lodge shuddering as gusts hit it from the northwest. Snow was coming in horizontal, piling against the north side of the earth berm I'd built, and the temperature had dropped to somewhere below 0. I couldn't see the thermometer I'd hung outside, couldn't even see 10 feet past the door, but the cold had a specific quality to it, a sharpness that felt personal. I'd kept the fire burning low through the night, just enough to keep the stones warm, and the lodge interior was maybe 40 degrees, survivable, but not comfortable. I fed the fire, built it up until the flames rose a foot high, and watched the smoke. It rose fast, pulled upward by the draft created by the wind, hitting the smoke flaps at the top of the lodge. The flaps themselves, 2 triangular pieces of canvas attached to poles that extended from the smoke hole, were set the way I'd left them the day before, angled to let smoke out and keep rain from coming in. But something was wrong. The smoke wasn't drawing cleanly. It rose, hit the opening at the top, and some of it escaped, while the rest swirled back down into the lodge. Within minutes, my eyes were watering, and the air was hazy with smoke that had nowhere to go. I pulled on my coat and went outside, the wind hitting me hard enough that I had to lean into it to stay upright. I grabbed the poles that controlled the smoke flaps and adjusted them, angling them more into the wind, trying to create a venturi effect that would pull the smoke out faster. The adjustment helped, but not enough. The smoke still wasn't drawing the way it should, and I couldn't figure out why. I went back inside, sat near the fire, and thought about Eugene's lodge. I'd watched him adjust the smoke flaps depending on wind direction, opening them wider when the wind was light, angling them sharply when it was strong. He'd made it look easy, intuitive, but I was realizing now that it wasn't. It was geometry. It was understanding how wind moves over a conical structure, how it creates pressure differentials, how the angle of the flaps could either pull smoke out or push it back down. The wind outside was coming from the northwest, which meant it was hitting the lodge at an angle, not straight on. The smoke flaps were set for a north wind. They'd work if the wind was coming directly at the front of them, but from an angle, they created turbulence instead of flow. I went back outside, adjusted the flaps again, this time rotating them to face more directly into the northwest wind. The change was immediate. The smoke began drawing cleanly, rising straight out of the hole without swirling back. Inside, the air cleared within minutes, and the fire burned hotter because it was getting better airflow. I stood outside for a few more minutes, watching the smoke rise and disappear into the storm, and started to understand something fundamental about the teepee's design. The smoke hole wasn't just a hole. It was an adjustable system, a tool that let you control not just where smoke went, but how heat moved through the lodge. When the flaps were open wide, heat escaped faster, but airflow was better. When they were partially closed, heat stayed in, but the fire got less oxygen. The angle of the flaps determined whether wind helped you or hurt you, whether it pulled heat out or pushed cold air in. It was a balance, and like everything else about living in the lodge, it required constant attention. Over the next few weeks, I learned to read the wind. Not just its direction, but its mood. A steady wind from the north meant setting the flaps one way. A gusty wind from the northwest meant adjusting them every few hours as the direction shifted. A calm day meant closing the flaps almost entirely to hold heat in, opening them just enough to let smoke escape. I learned that the shape of the teepee itself was designed to shed wind. The conical form meant wind hit the structure and slid over it rather than pushing against a flat wall. The steeper the angle of the sides, the better it worked. Eugene's lodge, I noticed, had a steeper pitch than mine. His poles were longer, the cover pulled tighter, and wind just rolled off it like water off a stone. I learned that the door placement mattered more than I'd thought. Facing east meant the prevailing winds from the west and north hit the back of the lodge, not the entrance. It meant morning sun warmed the door side first, made it easier to get up and start the day. It meant the structure was oriented with the land, not against it. And I learned that the smoke flaps were more than just a way to let smoke out. They were a way to control pressure inside the lodge. When the wind was strong, it created negative pressure at the top of the structure, pulling air up and out. By adjusting the flaps, I could increase or decrease that pull, which changed how fast the fire burned, how much heat stayed in, how much smoke lingered. It was engineering, but the kind that came from watching wind for generations, from trying things and failing and adjusting until it worked. One afternoon, Iris stopped by during a lull in the weather. She stood outside the lodge, looking at the smoke flaps, and said, "You're getting good at this." "I'm learning," I said. "Eugene told me you've been asking him questions." "He's been patient," she smiled. "He likes that you're doing it the hard way. Says most people would have given up by now." I didn't tell her that I'd thought about giving up, that there'd been nights when the cold was so complete and the fire so inadequate that I'd wondered if this whole thing was a mistake. But I hadn't given up, and part of the reason was that every small thing I figured out, digging down, heating stones, adjusting smoke flaps, made the next thing a little easier to understand. By mid-December, I could adjust the smoke flaps without thinking about it. I'd wake in the middle of the night, hear the wind shift, and know from the sound alone which way to move the poles. I could tell from the way smoke moved whether the fire was getting enough air, whether heat was escaping too fast, whether the lodge was balanced or fighting itself. The wind was still the wind, still cold, still relentless, still capable of finding every weakness in the structure. But it wasn't my enemy anymore. It was part of the system, a force I could work with instead of against. And on the nights when the wind was calm and the stars were clear and the smoke rose straight up into the frozen sky, I'd sit outside the lodge and watch it rise and feel something close to pride. Not because I'd conquered anything, but because I'd learned to listen. The land was teaching me. The wind was teaching me. And I was finally paying attention. By late December, the canvas cover had started to fail, not dramatically, no rips or tears, but in small ways that added up. Ice formed on the inside where my breath condensed against the fabric during the night. The canvas, even treated with wax and paraffin, wasn't truly waterproof, and when wet snow hit it, moisture seeped through and froze in thin layers that made the whole structure heavier, colder, less responsive to the heat I was generating inside. I'd wake in the morning and touch the canvas near my bedroll, and it would be stiff with frost. The fire would eventually thaw it, but by then I'd burned through more wood than I wanted, and the moisture that melted didn't evaporate. It just redistributed, soaking into the fabric, waiting to freeze again when the temperature dropped. Eugene had mentioned this. Canvas is fine for summer, he'd said, but winter, real winter, you want hide. I hadn't understood then. Now I did. Buffalo hide breathes. That's the part I hadn't known. The part you can't know until you've lived with canvas long enough to feel its limitations. Canvas traps moisture. Every breath you take, every bit of steam that rises from a pot of boiling water, every molecule of water vapor your body sheds during the night, it all hits the canvas and condenses. And once it condenses, it freezes or soaks in. And either way, you've got a problem. Hide, Eugene explained when I asked him about it, lets moisture pass through without letting heat escape. The fibers are porous in a way that woven canvas isn't, and water vapor can move through them while the structure of the hide itself still blocks wind and holds warmth. It's a membrane, not a barrier, and the difference matters when you're trying to stay dry in a space where condensation is constant. I couldn't afford buffalo hide. A full lodge cover ran into the thousands of dollars, and even if I could find one, it would take months to source and prepare. But Eugene had a spare cover, an old one he'd used years ago before he'd made his current lodge. It was patched in places, worn thin in others, but it was still functional, and he offered to loan it to me. "You'll feel the difference," he said. We spent a morning taking down my canvas cover and replacing it with the hide. The hide was heavier, stiffer, and it smelled like smoke and tallow, and something else I couldn't quite place, something animal and ancient. We stretched it over the poles, laced it tight, and staked it to the ground with the same wooden pegs I'd been using for the canvas. The first night in the hide lodge, I noticed the change immediately. The air inside felt different, drier, cleaner. I built the fire the way I'd been building it, heated stones, banked the coals, and went to sleep. When I woke in the middle of the night to add wood, I touched the inside of the hide and felt no frost. It was dry, slightly warm from the heat radiating inside the lodge, but dry. By morning, there was still no ice, no condensation dripping from the seams, no moisture soaking into the material and weighing it down. The hide was breathing. I could feel it when I sat near the wall, a faint movement of air, barely perceptible, where moisture was escaping through the hide itself. Not cold air coming in, but water vapor going out. The lodge was self-regulating in a way the canvas never had been, shedding the moisture I produced just by living in it while holding the heat I needed to stay warm. The other thing I noticed was sound. Wind against canvas sound sharp, percussive, like something trying to get in. Wind against hide sounds softer, more like breathing. The whole lodge moved differently in the wind, not snapping and pulling, but flexing, giving, absorbing the gusts and settling back into shape. I asked Eugene about it later, and he said it had to do with the way hide is constructed. Its skin, he said. It was alive once, part of an animal that lived in this same cold, same wind. The buffalo spent their whole lives in winter, and their hide evolved to handle it, thick enough to block wind, porous enough to breathe, flexible enough to move without tearing. When you use it for a lodge, you're not just using a material, you're using a system that's already been tested for thousands of years. I thought about that, about the buffalo that had stood in blizzards on these same plains, about the hide that had kept them warm, and about the people who'd figured out that what worked for the animal would work for them too. It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. The hide worked because it had been shaped by the same forces I was dealing with: cold, wind, moisture, the need to stay warm without burning through resources. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other differences. The hide held smells differently than canvas, absorbed the smoke from the fire in a way that became part of the material itself, so the whole lodge smelled like cedar and juniper and the particular scent of burning cottonwood. It darkened in places where smoke settled most often, creating a patina that told the story of where heat moved and where it lingered. The hide also warmed faster than canvas. Something about its density, maybe, or the way it absorbed and radiated heat. On sunny days, even when the air outside was below freezing, the south side of the lodge would warm from direct sunlight, and that warmth would spread through the material and into the interior space. And it was quieter. Canvas flaps and snaps in the wind, creating a constant background noise that you get used to but never fully escape. Hide moves in the wind, but it doesn't snap. It shifts, settles, breathes in a rhythm that's closer to natural sound than mechanical noise. I stopped waking up to frost on my blankets, stopped dealing with condensation dripping from the smoke hole, stopped fighting the moisture that had been a constant low-grade problem since the first cold night in October. The hide wasn't perfect. It was heavier, harder to adjust, and in places where it had worn thin, I could see light coming through during the day. But it worked in a way that felt complete, like I'd finally assembled all the pieces of the system and they were operating together the way they were supposed to. Eugene stopped by one evening, stood inside the lodge for a few minutes, and nodded. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," he said. I agreed. It felt right, not easy, not comfortable, in the way a modern house is comfortable, but right, appropriate, matched to the environment in a way that modern materials, no matter how advanced, couldn't quite achieve. The hide breathed. The earth held warmth. The stones radiated heat. The wind shaped how the lodge sat on the land. And I was finally living in balance with all of it, not fighting any single element, but learning how they fit together. Winter wasn't over. The coldest months were still ahead. But I had a shelter now that understood winter the way I was, beginning to understand it as something to work with, not against. January arrived with the kind of cold that stops being a temperature and starts being a presence. The thermometer outside the lodge read 18 below zero one morning, and that was before wind chill. The air felt solid, like something you had to push through rather than walk through, and every breath burned cold all the way down into your chest. But inside the lodge, I was warm. Not comfortable in the soft way of heated houses, but warm enough. Warm in a way that felt earned. The fire burned small and slow, barely more than a palm-sized bed of coals with a few pieces of juniper feeding it. I'd learned by now that fire size didn't correlate with warmth. Control did. A fire built right in the right place, with the right airflow, could heat the lodge more effectively with a handful of coals than a roaring blaze ever could. I'd learned this through failure, through nights of burning too much wood, overheating the space, then waking to freezing cold when the fire died. Through mornings, of rebuilding fires from scratch because I'd let them go out completely. Through the slow, frustrating process of understanding that fire is a negotiation, not a solution. The key was the draft. Eugene had shown me this, but I'd had to live it before I really understood. The smoke flaps at the top of the lodge, when set correctly, created a gentle pull, a draw that brought fresh air in through the gap at the base of the door and pulled it up and through the fire, then out the smoke hole. This constant flow of air meant the fire never suffocated, never burned too fast, just maintained itself at a steady, efficient rate. On calm days, I'd close the smoke flaps almost entirely, leaving just a small opening for smoke to escape. This trapped heat inside but reduced airflow, so the fire burned slower. I'd feed it once in the morning, once in the evening, and it would maintain itself through the day on just coals and a few small pieces of wood. On windy days, I'd open the flaps wider, angling them into the wind to create a stronger draw. The fire would burn hotter, but I could control it by adjusting the size of the wood I used, smaller pieces for sustained coals, larger pieces if I needed quick heat. The real breakthrough came when I started using the earth itself as part of the fire system. I'd dug the fire pit down about 6 inches into the floor, which meant the fire sat below the level where I slept and moved around. Cold air, which is heavier than warm air, would sink into the pit, flow through the fire, heat up, and rise. This created a natural convection current that circulated heat through the entire lodge without me having to do anything. I'd also learned to bank the fire at night in a way that kept coals alive until morning. I'd rake the burning wood into a tight pile, cover it with a thin layer of ash to reduce oxygen, then surround it with stones that would hold heat and protect the coals from drafts. In the morning, I'd brush away the ash, add kindling, and the fire would come back to life within minutes. This meant I wasn't waking every few hours to feed the fire. I could sleep through the night, actually sleep, deep and uninterrupted, and trust that the stones would radiate enough heat to keep the lodge above freezing, and that coals would still be alive when I needed them. The wood I'd gathered in the fall, 3 cords of mixed cottonwood, pine, and juniper, was lasting. By mid-January, I'd burned through maybe a third of it, which meant I'd make it to spring without running out. That math had seemed impossible in October, when I was burning through wood in a panic, but now it made sense. Small fires, efficient fires, fires that worked with the lodge instead of fighting it. I started noticing things about how different woods burned. Pine burned fast and hot, good for starting fires or heating stones quickly. Cottonwood burned slower, with less heat but longer duration, good for maintaining coals overnight. Juniper burned clean and hot, left almost no ash, and produced a coal bed that lasted hours. I kept each type of wood separated in stacks outside the lodge, and I'd choose what to burn based on what I needed. Morning fires were usually pine and juniper, fast heat to warm up quickly. Evening fires were cottonwood and juniper, slow burn to heat stones and create coals that would last through the night. The fire ring itself had evolved. I'd started with just a circle of stones, but over time I'd refined it. I'd built up the north side slightly, creating a small windbreak that protected the coals from drafts when I opened the door. I'd placed larger stones on the east and west sides, positioned to heat up during the day and radiate toward where I slept at night. I'd dug channels in the earth floor that directed cold air into the pit and warm air out and up, creating circulation patterns that didn't depend on me adjusting anything. The whole system, fire, stones, earth, airflow, had become self-regulating. I'd set it up in the morning, make small adjustments throughout the day based on weather and wind, and it would run itself through the night. Eugene visited one afternoon in late January, sat by the fire for a while, and watched how it burned. "You've got it now," he said. "Took long enough." "It takes as long as it takes," he said. "The important thing is you stopped fighting it. You're working with the fire now, not against it." I asked him what he meant. Most people, he said, they think fire is something you control. You build it big, you feed it constantly, you try to force it to do what you want. But fire has its own logic. It wants to burn, it wants oxygen, it wants fuel. If you give it those things in the right amounts, it'll do what you need. If you try to force it, it fights back, burns too hot, goes out, fills the lodge with smoke. I thought about the nights I'd spent feeding fires that burned through wood without warming the lodge, about the frustration of waking to cold and dead coals, about the gradual process of learning to let the fire be what it was instead of what I thought it should be. My grandfather used to say, Eugene continued, that a good fire is like a good friendship. You pay attention to it, you give it what it needs, but you don't smother it. You trust it to do its part if you do yours. The fire burned between us, small and patient, asking nothing but a few pieces of wood every few hours and the occasional adjustment of a smoke flap. By February, I could go a full day on one morning fire. I'd heat stones, bank the coals, adjust the flaps, and the lodge would stay warm enough through the afternoon and evening that I didn't need to rebuild until the next morning. The stones held heat for hours. The earth walls radiated warmth they'd absorbed over weeks of steady fire, and the hide cover breathed and flexed and kept everything balanced. I wasn't burning through wood, wasn't waking up cold, wasn't fighting the fire or the cold or the wind. I was just living, and the fire, small and steady, was just burning. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday 3 weeks into February. I'd been watching it build for 2 days, the sky going gray and heavy, the wind shifting to come straight from the north, the particular quality of light that means snow is coming and it's going to stay for a while. By Monday evening, the first flakes were falling, small and dry, the kind that doesn't stick but warns you about what's behind it. By Tuesday morning, I couldn't see 20 feet past the door. The wind had picked up overnight, driving the snow horizontal, piling it in drifts against the north side of the earth berm and filling in any depression in the land. I woke to the sound of wind against hide, that deep breathing sound, and lay there for a few minutes listening to the storm work. The lodge was warm. The fire had burned down to coals overnight, the way I'd banked it, and the stones placed around the perimeter were still radiating heat. I could feel warmth rising from the earth floor, held there by weeks of steady fire and the insulation of the earth walls. The temperature inside was probably 45, maybe 50 degrees, cold by house standards, but warm enough that I could move around in just a shirt and not feel the kind of biting cold that makes your joints ache. I rebuilt the fire, fed it slowly, adjusted the smoke flaps to account for the north wind, and settled in. Storm days were different from regular days. The light was dim and gray, filtered through snow and canvas, and the smoke hole that was mostly covered to keep wind from driving snow into the lodge. Time moved differently, slower, measured by the intervals between feeding the fire rather than by clocks or the position of the sun. I spent the morning repairing a pair of gloves, sewing a tear in the seam with sinew, and a needle Eugene had given me. The work was meditative, the kind of thing you can do near a fire while snow piles up outside and the world shrinks down to the circle of warmth around you. Around noon, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm, an engine, a truck from the sound of it, moving slow and struggling with the snow. It got closer, then stopped, and a few minutes later, someone knocked on the pole near the door. I pulled back the flap, and Bill Torstensen stood there, covered in snow, his face red from cold and wind. "Jesus Christ," he said, "you're really out here." "Yeah. Can I come in?" I stepped aside and he ducked through the door, stamping snow off his boots, looking around the lodge with the kind of expression people get when what they're seeing doesn't match what they expected. "It's warm," he said. "Yeah. I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought you'd be huddled under blankets, barely surviving. But it's warm in here." I gestured for him to sit near the fire, and he did, pulling off his gloves and holding his hands toward the flames. He looked at the stones arranged around the perimeter, at the earth floor, at the way the lodge sat low in the ground with walls of dirt sloping up to meet the hide cover. "Where's the fire pit?" he asked. "Right here," I said, pointing to the shallow depression in the center of the floor where the fire burned. "No, I mean the pit, the dugout part where you'd normally build a fire." "This is it," I said. "The whole floor is dug down. Fire sits at ground level, inside the lodge." He looked confused for a moment, then understanding settled on his face. "You dug the whole floor down." 14 inches. Huh? He sat there warming his hands, looking at the fire and the stones, and the way heat seemed to come from everywhere instead of just the flames. "My granddad did something like this. Old sod house he built before my dad was born, dug it into a hillside, used the earth for walls. He said it stayed warm all winter with barely any fire." "Same principle," I said. He nodded slowly. "And the stones? They hold heat. I heat them in the fire during the day, move them to the edges at night. They radiate for hours. So you don't have to keep the fire burning all night." "Right." He sat there for a while longer, not saying anything, just absorbing the warmth and the quiet inside the lodge while the storm raged outside. Finally he said, "I came out here to check on you. Thought maybe you'd need a ride into town, a warm place to stay until this blows over." "I'm fine," I said. "I can see that." He stood, pulled his gloves back on, looked around the lodge one more time. "You know, when you first put this up, I thought you were crazy. Thought you'd last maybe a month before you gave up and moved back to wherever you came from." "I thought about it," I admitted. "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" "I thought about that. About the nights I'd spent shivering, about the frustration of fires that didn't work, about the slow process of learning to listen to what the cold and the wind and the earth were trying to teach me." "Because giving up would have meant I didn't understand," I said. "And I wanted to understand." He nodded, pulled the door flap aside, and cold wind rushed in, carrying snow and the sound of the storm. "Well," he said, "you figured it out. Stay warm. You too." He left, and I pulled the door flap closed behind him, adjusted it so cold air wasn't seeping in, and sat back down by the fire. The interruption had let some heat escape, but within a few minutes the lodge was warm again, the stones doing their work, the fire burning small and patient. I thought about Bill driving out here in a blizzard, convinced he'd find me in trouble, and instead finding me warm and comfortable in a lodge that didn't look like it should work, but did. I thought about his grandfather and the sod house, about the knowledge that gets passed down and the knowledge that gets forgotten, and about the difference between the two. The storm lasted another day and a half. I stayed inside most of that time, leaving only to gather snow to melt for water and to make sure the smoke flaps weren't getting buried. The fire burned steady, the stones radiated heat, and the lodge held its warmth the way it was designed to. When the storm finally broke and the sun came out, I stepped outside into a world transformed. Snow had drifted 6 feet high against the north berm, covered the prairie in white that sparkled so bright it hurt to look at, and buried everything that wasn't protected or anchored. But the lodge was fine. The poles stood straight, the hide cover intact, the smoke hole clear. I cleared the snow from the door, checked the stakes, and stood there in the cold morning light, looking at the structure I'd built and rebuilt and learned to live in. It looked small against the landscape, a cone of hide barely taller than the drifts around it, but it had kept me warm through the worst storm of the season, and I'd slept through most of it, trusting the earth and the stones and the fire to do what they'd been doing for weeks now. Bill drove past later that afternoon, saw me outside, and slowed down. He rolled his window down and called out, "Made it through?" "Made it through." He nodded like he'd expected that answer this time, and kept driving. I went back inside, fed the fire, and sat there as the afternoon light came through the smoke hole and lit the interior of the lodge in a way that felt like home. March came with false promises. The temperature would climb above freezing for a day or two, melting the top layer of snow into slush, and you'd start to believe winter was finally letting go. Then it would drop back below zero overnight, freeze everything solid again, and remind you that spring out here doesn't arrive, it negotiates. I'd been in the lodge for 5 months by then, long enough that the rhythms of it had become automatic, waking with first light, building up the fire, heating stones, adjusting smoke flaps based on wind direction without consciously thinking about it. Long enough that the earth floor felt normal under my feet, that the smell of smoke and hide and burning juniper was just what air smelled like. But I could feel winter losing its grip. The sun had more strength to it now, rising higher in the sky, staying longer. On clear afternoons, the south side of the lodge would warm from direct sunlight, and I could sit near the wall and feel heat soaking through the hide in a way that hadn't been possible in December or January. I started taking the lodge apart in my mind before I started taking it apart physically, thinking about which poles would need to be stored where, how to fold the hide cover so it wouldn't crack, what I'd learned that I needed to write down or remember for next time, because there would be a next time. I knew that now. Eugene stopped by one afternoon in mid-March, sat by the fire, and watched me work on a pair of moccasins I'd been making from scrap leather. "You staying through spring?" he asked. "Thinking about it," I said. "Maybe through summer." He nodded. "You've got the skills now. Winter's the hard teacher, but if you make it through one, the rest get easier." I asked him what he meant by that. "First winter," he said. "You're learning everything, how to heat the lodge, how to stay dry, how to work with the wind and the earth. It's overwhelming. You make mistakes because you don't know what you don't know. But once you've done it, once you've lived through real cold and figured out how to survive it, the knowledge stays with you. Next winter won't be easy, but it won't be as hard. You'll know what to do before the cold comes, instead of figuring it out while you're shivering." I thought about the first night I'd spent in the lodge, lying on bare ground with no fire, thinking I understood what I was getting into. I thought about the panic of burning through wood too fast, the frustration of fires that didn't keep me warm, the slow realization that I didn't know how heat actually moved or how cold actually worked. "The lodge taught me," I said. "The lodge, the earth, the wind, they all taught you," Eugene agreed. "But you had to be willing to listen. Most people aren't. They fight the land, try to force it to behave the way they think it should, and they either break or they leave. I almost left, but you didn't. No." We sat there in silence for a while, the fire burning small between us, and I thought about what I'd learned. Not just the practical things, how to dig a floor, heat stones, adjust smoke flaps, but the deeper things. That survival isn't about dominating the environment, but about finding your place in it. That cold isn't an enemy, it's a condition you learn to work with. That the old ways aren't romantic or nostalgic, they're functional, refined through generations of people who couldn't afford to make mistakes. By early April, the snow was mostly gone. Patches remained in shaded areas and on the north side of hills, but the prairie was greening up, the first grass pushing through the thawed earth. I started spending more time outside, less time tending the fire. The lodge, which had been my whole world through the winter, became just a place to sleep, and I realized I'd started thinking of it differently. Not as a shelter I was fighting to keep warm, but as a home that knew how to take care of itself if I took care of it. I took the lodge down on a warm afternoon in late April. The poles came apart easily, the lashings loosened, the hide cover rolled and folded and stored in Eugene's barn, where it would stay dry and safe until next fall. I filled in the floor, spreading the earth from the berm back into the pit I'd dug, tamping it down until the ground looked almost like it had before I'd arrived. But not quite. You could still see where the lodge had been, a circular depression in the grass, a pattern of where the door had faced east, stones scattered around the perimeter that I'd used and then left behind. I stood there looking at that circle, and I thought about what winter had given me. Not just survival skills, though. I'd learned those. Not just an understanding of how heat and cold and earth interact, though I'd learned that too. Winter had given me patience, the kind that comes from realizing that some things can't be rushed, that understanding takes time, that failure is just information if you're willing to learn from it. It had given me respect for the land, for the people who'd lived on it before me, for the knowledge they'd accumulated through centuries of cold and hardship and careful attention to what worked. And it had given me confidence. Not the loud kind that comes from thinking you've conquered something, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you can handle hard things if you're willing to learn how. Bill Torstenson drove past while I was loading the last of my gear into the truck. He stopped, got out, walked over to where the lodge had been. "Taking it down?" he asked. "For now," I said. "You coming back next winter?" "Planning on it." He looked at the circular depression in the grass, at the stones, at the packed earth where the fire had burned for 5 months. "You did good," he said. "Better than I thought you would." It wasn't quite an apology for doubting me, but it was close enough. I drove away that afternoon, the truck loaded with poles and canvas and stones and the accumulated debris of a winter spent learning how to live in a way most people had forgotten. In the rearview mirror, I could see the circle where the lodge had been, and I knew I'd be back. Because winter wasn't something I'd survived, it was something I'd started to understand. And understanding, I'd learned, is a gift that doesn't fade with the thaw.